My Govanden, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and this video is going to be a little different because recently something popped up in my YouTube feed which I hadn't been looking for, but proved to be an interesting idea for a video, and that is a different channel, which is just Jazza, or Jazza, I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce it, Jazza, and the guy is an artist and he draws a lot of different stuff, and he had done apparently a video before where he had done art of different monsters from different stories according to the descriptions in the books, not relying on movie interpretations. And the one that he had done in this prior video was Balrog, and apparently this was popular enough that he ended up doing a whole video dedicated to Lord of the Rings creatures and did 4 of them. And I thought it was interesting how he tried to interpret the stuff from the books without really relying too much on other visual adaptations of these different creatures. So I wanted to kind of go through them and give my take on how he did in terms of being faithful to the book descriptions. So I'm not going to do the one on the Balrog because that was a separate video, but I am going to do this other one that was just 4 things from the Lord of the Rings. You can go check out the one with the Balrog yourself. I'll link to both videos in the description. But let's take a quick look at these 4 creatures, which he begins with the Ents. Now, the Ent description that he uses, of course, is for Treebeard. He doesn't really get into other descriptors for other Ents that Merry and Pippin see, which makes sense. Most of them are just kind of references to other trees and the number of toes they have. And so he kind of primarily relies on their first impression when they see Treebeard, not realizing what he is, and just see what they describe as kind of a stump of what looks kind of like a gnarled old man. And he mentions that there's 2 bent branches, and the way that he kind of seems to interpret the imagery is that the stump is a stump with holes in it, which are really just gaps between legs and arms. And the 2 bent branches are 2 other actual trees that have somehow started growing in Treebeard, like their seeds just kind of ended up in him and started growing out of him. I always took, and this is, not necessarily this must be what it is, but my interpretation of this description was always that the 2 bent branches are actually his arms. He's probably holding, at least my view is, Treebeard was holding his arms up like, branches. And so the rest of him looks like a stump, but his arms are the 2 branches. So in that regard, my idea of what Treebeard looks like is very different from what his interpretation ends up being, with the arms reaching all the way to the ground. And I don't think there's anything in the book that makes this explicit, but I always get the idea that while his arms are probably kind of long, they don't reach all the way to the ground. That being said, otherwise his idea of what Treebeard looks like is pretty good. I mean, one of the things that we know about Treebeard, and he doesn't explicitly reference this in the video, is that he is described as having very little movement at the knees, but he still has a long stride. And if you look at this image that he's drawn, it really does look like he has knees, but that they probably don't bend much. But if he, the waist is so high that if he takes a good step with his just bending at the hips, he's going to end up taking a really long stride. So I like that. I like the fact that his face looks humanish, but not totally obviously a face. I think in some ways Peter Jackson's, movies did a little bit better in that regard of making Treebeard's face not obviously face-like. And while he does mention that Treebeard's beard is very twiggy at the roots, and I don't think he explicitly mentions that the ends are more kind of wispy and mossy type, but the drawing he creates is not quite detailed enough to get that level of description across, but the beard itself looks fine for the level of detail that he put into it. So I think that's, good enough as it goes. So all in all, I would probably say that, I mean, he does a pretty good job of not, I mean, he doesn't violate anything in the text, clearly. Uh, as far as my own personal interpretation, I say probably I'd give this one an 8 out of 10 because I do think there are a couple of things that are not how I think we're supposed to understand it and that I think could be maybe improved a smidge, but it's still a really good depiction. Next, he goes into the fell beasts, which this one gets a little bit interesting because here we do also have some interpretive choices to make. He does refer to Tolkien's letters, where Tolkien himself says in response to a reader's question that they are obviously in some way pterodactylic. And he also mentions another description of them as being kind of like a hairless hawk, which he actually pulls up an image in the video of a hairless hawk. Watch the video. It's horrifyingly ugly. But the hawk image that he pulls up really is like, he takes that and runs with it, and you'll see what I mean if you watch the video. But this version of what he draws is, you know, it very definitely looks kind of fell beastish, and there are other depictions of the fell beasts that have similar kinds of starting points in their reference, if you know what I mean. But his really, I think, takes it more in that direction than most that I've seen. And in that regard, I think it is definitely more accurate than the Peter Jackson version, which he actually, in the process of kind of doing his own, he ends up showing images from other artists that have done their own depictions of most of these. And he points out that John Howe's illustration looks a lot like the one in the movie, which is probably because the movie, I think, used John Howe's idea of the fell beast specifically for their own, with that, you know, really long neck and all that, which really is not warranted from the text at all. It's cool, don't get me wrong. John Howe is a great artist, and I like most of what he does, but he does have a tendency to over-exaggerate some things. One of the things that he really focuses on in his interpretation in this video is the idea that it's described as being grown beyond the measure of all other things that fly. And he says, well, you know what other things fly? Dragons, so it must be bigger than dragons. And I don't think Tolkien meant that literally. I suspect what he was really going for was other flying things besides dragons, because at this point in the story, for one thing, there really aren't any dragons left in Middle-earth. There may be a few, like north of the Iron Hills or something, but I don't think Tolkien really meant that these fell beasts were supposed to be bigger than Ancalagon the Black, let's say. I don't know that the artist here actually knows that much about Ancalagon the Black. He definitely has read plenty of Tolkien's stuff in studying to do these descriptions, but I don't know that he's like read all the Silmarillion and just knows all this stuff offhand. So I don't know how much he knows. But the point is, I don't think the fell beasts are supposed to be that big, because Ancalagon the Black is described in terms of like just enormously huge, and that just wouldn't. I mean, if Ancalagon the Black-sized beasts were roaming around the battlefield on the Pelennor, I don't think there would have actually been any chance of defending against that. So I think he's talking about bigger than birds and maybe even bigger than the great eagles, but not that big. So I don't really think that we had to go that big. But if you look at the description, at the illustration rather, that he creates, it's not like he drew the thing that huge, but it is definitely really big. And proportionately, it looks bigger than what is in the Peter Jackson movies even. And those are pretty big. He also definitely, as you can see, takes the whole hairless hawk idea. Like that, the head of this thing definitely looks very bird-like, but without any feathers. And just the ugliness of it, without any feathers, hair, or anything like that. And it's not super pterodactylic, but it's, you're not going to get both hairless hawk and pterodactyl, and, you can't really perfectly merge those two. So, I think overall, This isn't necessarily exactly what I imagine when I think of the fell beasts, but I think in terms of sticking to what the text says, it's basically 10 out of 10. I mean, you can't really fault it for much of anything. This third one is Shelob, and this is where he gets really interesting and I think takes his interpretation a little bit astray, but nevertheless it doesn't hurt the illustration too much. So he talks about a lot of the different descriptors of Shelob, and one of those that he kind of hones in on a little bit is the fact that Shelob is the spawn of Ungoliant, who came from the outer dark. And he says, well, the outer dark could be interpreted as space, so you could interpret this as kind of like a space creature type thing. That's not what the outer dark is, and again, I don't fault him for this. I don't know that he's read Tolkien all that closely, but the outer dark is not outer space. It's literally, if you think of the physical universe as being, everything there is, the outer dark is actually outside of that. There's just a void outside of that. When Eru and the Ainur sing the world into existence, basically, they're in the void, and then within the void, Ea is created by Eru Iluvatar, and they enter into it from the void. So we're talking about just the not physical universe when we're talking about the outer void. So his interpretation definitely does look like it could be kind of spacey, sci-fi-ish a little bit, but it's not horribly so, and so I don't think it really ruins the actual interpretation, but it's definitely taking it in a direction which I don't really think Tolkien was intending to go with it. But one thing that he does do that I like is the fact that he really takes the fact that we have descriptions of horns and a stalk-like neck and, these things that differentiate Shelob from an actual spider. Because as he points out, the Peter Jackson version, and a lot of other versions too, really, are really just big spiders. They're not really very different from spiders. He also takes the reference to there being claws on the ends of the legs, and you can see that they're kind of like, almost like crab claws, which it's not really clear what kind of claw Tolkien meant, but I always thought of something a little more articulated, not, like maybe a bird claw, but with less joints and a thicker, less talon-like end. But he goes in kind of the direction of sort of like a crab claw, it looks like. So again, that's a difference of interpretation. It's not really clear what kind of claw Tolkien is describing. He just says claw. Another thing he talks about in the description, Tolkien that is the legs, are barely holding this vast bulk of a belly up above the ground, or even dragging it along the ground, but that the knees of the legs are still above the body. And he's interpreted this in a way that I don't think really 100% matches that, because his legs don't look long enough to really do that job. I always interpreted this as being almost kind of like a harvestman or granddaddy longleg or whatever you call those things. Not with the size of the body, but with the idea that the legs are so long that even though the body itself has grown beyond any normal proportion for a spider, you've got this massive uptick of a leg that then comes all the way back down, and so you'd end up with a really pronounced angle on the legs with the knees going way up and then the feet all the way back down, and just kind of have this like mountains on either side of the body crawling along, which I think is even creepier than what he's done here as far as the legs go. Another thing that I think is a little bit off, and he doesn't specifically reference this point in his audio of just reading the description of Shelob, is the way he did the eyes, I don't think matches what Tolkien describes. Because he talks about clusters of eyes, but I don't think he means like what's in this image where it's like a bug's eye almost of, a globe that's just faceted. It's not really supposed to be like that. I think it's supposed to be more spider-like in the sense of their individual eyes kind of clustered together. And so when Sam stabs one, he stabs an eye in the middle of a cluster of eyes. So I don't think the way he did the eyes is really accurate to the description in the book, but again, he didn't read that part either, so I don't know if that's just because he didn't see that part in the book, because, I mean, if you read through the chapter where we get Shelob, we get different parts of the description in different areas, and so it's hard to find everything. Then again, this guy references letters and things, so he did his research, so I don't know why he overlooked this, or maybe he didn't overlook it but is just interpreting it a different way. But overall, I think I would give this probably another 8 out of 10 because of, like I say, the legs I think are too short to be as described, and the eyes are not quite right, I don't think. But, I mean, overall, he did a really good job, like with the luminous belly and the, all this other stuff. I still think the belly actually could have been better, because when I think of the description of Tolkien, I really think of like this huge, almost fluid-filled bag that's just kind of waving from side to side disgustingly, and like, that's my idea of Shelob's abdomen. But I mean, it's still really good in this illustration too, so well done. All right, our final one is Sauron himself, which this one is interesting because we get very little physical description of Sauron, of course, because virtually nobody has seen him, and the only one that we know of that has seen him is Gollum, and the only thing he really talks about is the fact that he's got 4 fingers on the black hand. That's not a lot to go on, right? We don't really know anything about his face except to the extent that we get his eyes. And I think there's more descriptions of Sauron and his terribleness than he goes into in his video, but none of them are really all that super descriptive, and this is a thing with Tolkien. He doesn't usually describe faces in great detail. He tells us Aragorn has dark hair flecked with gray and that it's shaggy. Beyond that, we get nothing, right? He doesn't explicitly even say Aragorn has no beard. We're just left to infer that from the fact that he doesn't describe one. And, this is, I think the most description we get of most faces is probably the hobbits. Like, they have rosy cheeks for the most part, and they have, this kind of thing. But you don't get a lot of physical descriptions of anybody's faces. And so Sauron's actual facial structure, what he looks like, is left completely up to the imagination almost. Now, he interprets some of the things that we get as being references to Sauron actually having black or at least dark skin, because Gollum refers to 4 fingers on the black hand. So the hand itself is black, so his skin is black. I don't know that that's what Gollum means. Gollum could be just calling it the black hand as a way of denoting it's the hand of Sauron, who is the Dark Lord, and, it could be that the skin actually is black. It's not really clear, but it's certainly one way to interpret it. He does also describe what we see from Frodo's perspective when he looks in the Mirror of Galadriel, although I think he says that in the video that Frodo's looking in the Palantir. So he may be describing what Pippin sees in the Palantir, or he may be describing what Frodo sees in the Mirror of Galadriel. I haven't cross-checked exactly the lines that he quotes with the 2 passages to determine which, but he's either mixing up which hobbit it is or the method of seeing, but that's really beside the point. But he talks about the description of the eye and it being lidless and wreathed with flame. Pretty sure that's the Mirror of Galadriel scene that we get. But the interesting thing that I got out of that, he specifically references the lidless bit, which I think he tried to put into this, but again, kind of like the int one, it's not detailed enough to really get that effect of there being no lid. But one thing that I thought was interesting that he kind of overlooked, he does do a yellowish eye, which fits with the fact that it says it's yellow like a cat's in that Mirror of Galadriel scene. That part is there. And then immediately after that, it talks about the slit of the pupil, which gives the impression that not only is the yellow like a cat, but also the shape of the pupil is like a cat. And he didn't actually mention that, which I thought that was kind of a big thing to miss, because if you're going to do Sauron's eye, this is one thing that Peter Jackson does actually get right. The fact that it's the eye has a pupil that looks like a cat's slitted eye. And this Peter Jackson does do right, even though the eye itself being like at the top of the tower is completely wrong. That's messed up, and this guy points out that's really not what's going on, because Sauron does actually have a body at this point in the story. So he gets that part right, but then he doesn't do the slitted eye, which I thought really would have been a cool thing to put there, because if you think about it, one of the descriptors is, and he mentions this I think in his video, that the eye of Sauron, the terrible, few could endure. And you could imagine why a guy who's already kind of terrifying because he's a Dark Lord and, all this other stuff, but if he also has an eye that has this unnaturally shaped pupil for a humanoid form, how that is also going to just unnerve you to no end, right? So, like, the face and all that stuff, I can't critique, because there's really no descriptors of in Tolkien of what Sauron's face looks like at this point in the story. But I think he really missed a great cue when he overlooked that slit in the description that Frodo sees. And so if we had actually gotten a more zoomed in look at Sauron's face, such that we could actually see the pupils of his eyes and it be slit shaped like a cat's, I think that would have been really like the highlight of this illustration. So I'll give him a 9 out of 10 on this one, because like it looks great, and it's a really good illustration, given that we have very little to go on, and he does get a lot of things right. But I think missing that one little cue of the slit shape, that would have been like the icing on the cake that would have really made this perfect. So really good, but could have been just that little bit better. So that's my look at Jazza's, attempts at illustrating 4 different creatures from the Lord of the Rings. Like I said, he did a really good job overall. Could have been better in a few areas, and took different interpretations than I do in a few other areas, but not necessarily wrong interpretations, just not exactly what I imagined. And, you could fit it with a text. But let me know what you guys think about these different, illustrations, and how they match up with your idea of what these different creatures and characters would look like, because everybody's imagination is different. And one thing that I really like this guy for is the fact that he tries to go back to the book description and undo sort of the kind of corruption of our imaginations that the movies have led to, because so often, if you've seen the movies, especially as many times as I have in my life, we kind of lose the ability to imagine our own versions of things anymore. And so it's really nice to get different takes on things, so that you have different reference points for ways to imagine these. And he does a good job of going to descriptions that are not just even in the books, but even from Tolkien's letters and all this other stuff. So it's really nice that he pulls together a lot of different material to get the starting point for his own interpretation of these things. So I really applaud that approach, because that is the way we should be imagining these, is from the text, and not just kind of using the movies as a default. So that's great. But yeah, let me know what you think of these, different interpretations, how they match up with yours, what you think went right, what you think went wrong, because there's, room for a lot of different interpretation one way or the other. But in terms of comparing to the text itself, I think he did a great job, and I think it's hard to fault him for a lot of stuff. So that I thought was really cool to look at, because it was a guy who's not necessarily just a Lord of the Rings guy, but going in and just taking written prompts and going, well, here's what I come up with. So really cool. Thought it was a different thing to do with my videos. If you have other stuff that you think maybe might fit this kind of video and like to see more of it, we can, maybe send those in suggestions in the comments or on the Discord channel. Speaking of the Discord channel, of course, make sure you check the description below for social and support links and all that good stuff. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, share it around, subscribe to catch all my future content, and if you're on YouTube, of course, click the bell icon. And follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions every week. Till the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially Nathan Dufour, Paul Leone, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.